So the good thing about an illustrious panel like this is that they are well known in our benefits community. But for the folks who may not be familiar, Dallas Salisbury is the CEO emeritus of EBRI and the founder of that organization back in 1978 was, right? Howard Fleur, chairman emeritus of Siegel Company and former chair of the board of EBRI. Phyllis Borzi, former Secretary of Labor for the Employee Benefit Security Administration during the Obama administration, and a 16-year vet. Can folks hear me in the back? Okay, no. Thank you very much for joining us. And let's jump right into it. And we want to leave some questions. And I think this one's working better. Thank you. So going to go back to pre-ERISA. And Howard, you were the only one, I think, involved in the world of employee benefits before 1974. And I'm just curious, you might take a moment to describe the Wild West of pre-ERISA. And more importantly, what do you think were some of the ills of the system that the law was intended to address?
Well, I think
Technology will get you every time. Here comes another one.
I think it's the usual when you're in the Wild West, you don't realize it.
Can you juggle 3 of them at once?
And it was an interesting system in lowercase, but there was some government regulation and there was a motivation to help people. That's where it came from. I switched from insurance companies after 5 years and went into consulting because I thought this whole pension thing might be interesting, and having had experience as a health actuary, it seemed like a good thing to do. The ills were, in some ways, more that people weren't covered, but then it was also because there wasn't enough motivation except for some ancient companies, but there was also the issue of security. And I think many of you have heard about the famous Studebaker case. And although I think more people became familiar with Studebaker at that time than anybody who ever owned one. And that really brought it to the fore. And you can tell it brought it to the fore because there was a program on 60 Minutes about it, which led to hue and cry around. And I would say that ERISA was mostly well-motivated to provide protection and to some extent to encourage people, employers, to do something about it. And from the labor side, it was mixed as to what areas of organized labor were pro and what areas were against. But ultimately, through remarkable political ability of Jacob Javits and Harrison Williams, it actually came to pass. And our question was, is this good news or bad news for consultants? And the answer is yes.
And real quickly, who were the components of the labor union movement that was for it and against it?
Those who worked in who were multi-employer plans, so the sponsors of multi-employer plans, generally were against it because they wanted to maintain their control and influence. And those like the auto workers, where they were industrial unions, were mostly in favor of it. And from the point of view of clout, it was mixed. But in general, employers, I think to their credit, and certainly those caring about the general population, really were, well, they were in a position because of 60 Minutes and some others, they really had no choice but to be supportive. And again, Javits was remarkably effective at getting it done. He was from an antediluvian thing called a Rockefeller Republican.
Thanks, Howard. So, Dallas, I think you were at the Department of Justice in 1974, and then you got posted over to the Department of Labor. So this enormous new law had just been enacted, and now all of a sudden the executive branch agency is like, all right, now how do we implement and enforce it? What were some of the big picture issues that the agencies had to grapple with now that this law was law of the land?
Well, as noted, a major feature of ERISA was reporting and disclosure. And when Harvard professor John Dunlop became labor secretary, the first issue that was an ERISA issue that hit his desk is that the Labor Department had implemented in the first wave of ERISA something called the EBS-1. And the EBS-1 was sitting at the first filing, tens of thousands of them in boxcars on the railroad spare tracks at Union Station. And he was getting a tremendous amount of negative feedback from the House and the Senate members who said, we're getting all of our small businesses complaining to us about this new cost and administrative burden, but the government's doing nothing with it. Why are you wasting our money? And Dunlop immediately said to some of them, well, we will create a new agency. And so suddenly the position of responsibility for ERISA, which had been resting with the Assistant Secretary for the Labor Management Services Administration, became the first manifestation of a separate program, and a gentleman from the Justice Department, James Hutchinson, suddenly became the first administrator of this new program, end quotes. And so it was at that point Dunlop bringing in a dedicated political appointee to deal with ERISA, and the first action signed by that person, literally the day he arrived at the Labor Department, was a repeal of the EBS-1 form. And that made not only the secretary very happy, but it made many people on Capitol Hill very happy. They then moved to the next critical regulatory area, the participation and vesting standards, because if you don't define participation, then fiduciary and other provisions are somewhat meaningless. The third priority was the fiduciary standards, which led to the initial version of the multi-part test, which was the rule of the day until, should we say, quite recently, after a number of attempts. So that was the main, and then the final major priority that was one of the responsibilities that actually I'd attended my first meeting related to ERISA before it was law in July of 1974. And it was a debate between the then Solicitor Bill Kilberg with the former Deputy Secretary of Labor and former Solicitor of Labor, who was then Deputy Attorney General, over which agency should have what type of enforcement authorities and ability. And the result of those ultimately was that the Labor Department began its investigation of the Teamsters Union Pension Fund. And so it moved into the enforcement as really the third major priority.
Thank you. Phyllis, you arrived on Capitol Hill in 1979. So I'm sure after 5 years of this law in the books, there were, either issues that hadn't been dealt with in the original law, or maybe issues that were emerging that hadn't been anticipated. And I'm sort of curious, what were the priorities of Congress in those early years? And maybe you would add a particular reflection, if you would. I mean, ERISA, employee benefits, is this amalgam of labor law and tax law. And so it's not surprising that from the beginning until the current day, there are competing committees of jurisdiction, tax committees, labor committees, and the executive branch as well. So how did some of those skirmishes play out?
It wasn't an easy set of times. I'll just say that. I was a law student when ERISA was passed, and I answered an ad on the bulletin board for a law student to work at a small consulting firm that had just been established by Steve Shanis, who was the first executive director of the PBGC and who had committed to spend 1 year setting up the PBGC. And then he thought he was going back to San Diego, where his wife and 5 children still were there. So I started, my first experience with ERISA was as a law student. My job was every day that I was at the office, I would go around to all the agencies, pick up their press releases, their compliance alerts, and I'd take all that technical jargon and put it into a newsletter that went to all of our clients. It was a wonderful experience for me. I met a person named Dallas Salisbury. I met a lot of people, several people that had worked on the Hill, not just for the Senate. Howard, you mentioned Senators Javits and Williams. On the House side, Congressman John Erlenborn, who was the ranking Republican on what was then the Ed and Workforce, and John Dent from Pennsylvania, were the two people on the House side that were involved. And in 1979, because of a complete fluke, i.e. I had some little experience with ERISA because of my student days, and I was willing to work cheap, which back then was the hallmark for getting a job on the Hill. In my later years, as I reflected on it, I didn't know anybody. I had no connections. I think it's hard probably now for people without connections to get jobs. But anyway, so I arrived on my first day of work on the Hill was February 2nd, 1979. Is there anybody in this audience who can tell me why that date was important?
It's Groundhog Day.
Well, it is Groundhog Day, but that wasn't the reason. It was the day that what ultimately became the Multi-Employer Pension Plan Amendments Act of 1980 was introduced. And I was hired to work on it. Now, did I know anything about multi-employer plans? Not really. But I was willing to work cheap and I was at the right place at the right time. So the first priority in 1979 when I arrived was to try to figure out what, if anything, Congress needed to do about the multi-employer program. For those of you who remember when ERISA was passed, because of the lobbying of the multi-employer plans, the termination insurance program was effective for single employer plans, but kept getting deferred for multi-employer plans. And the day of reckoning, people figured in 1979 was the day we better, roll up our sleeves and figure out what to do. That was my first experience with this multi-jurisdictional question. Title IV of ERISA came out of the labor committees. And so one would think that the labor committees would have sole, if not primary, jurisdiction over amendments to the to Title IV. However, the premiums in the next decade or so kept getting flipped from on budget to off budget, depending on when the Ways and Means Committee and Finance Committee needed extra revenue. So the tax committees weighed in jurisdictionally because they characterized the premium as a tax. And that's how we wound up with 4 committees of jurisdiction: the tax and labor committees and the tax and the Finance and Ways and Means Committee. So that was my first foray into the congressional jurisdiction. But the thing that sticks most in my mind, Jim, is the fight that we had when Congress began to fill in the gaps in healthcare, because the healthcare jurisdiction was even more muddled than the pension jurisdiction. The public programs, Medicare and Medicaid, were a constant struggle, jurisdictional struggle between, on the House side, the Ways and Means Committee and the Energy and Commerce Committee. And the loose division of labor, if you will, was that Medicare was Ways and Means. Medicaid was Energy and Commerce primarily, but with Ways and Means involved. So the first big healthcare bill that came through when I was there was the health insurance continuation provisions that were included in the 1985 COBRA reconciliation legislation. And there we were introduced, we had a rude awakening. The bill that was the forerunner of the COBRA provision was a joint bill by Ways and Means, Pete Stark, who chaired the Health Subcommittee at Ways and Means, and my then boss, Bill Clay, who chaired the Labor Management Relations Subcommittee at Ed and Labor. At some point during the process, the Energy and Commerce Committee decided to assert its jurisdiction, and they did so in a very creative way. It was clear that Energy and Commerce had jurisdiction over the business of insurance. They argued, however, that because health plans were an amalgam of self-insured, fully insured, hybrid, that the Energy and Commerce jurisdiction was not just the business of insurance, but when there was no insurance. Sort of an interestingly broad concept. And eventually it was worked out among the three committees, and so the three committees did it. So those were the two things.
Well, thanks. And you actually answered a question I was going to ask later on, and that is dispelling the myth that ERISA never was intended to cover health
well,
benefits.
that's
You
a
know, the
bigger
word
myth.
retirement is in the law, but not the word health.
There are
So,
two myths with respect to that. The first myth is the well-trafficked but completely wrong myth that the framers of ERISA, the Javitzes, the Earl and Bournes, the Dents, the Williams, made a mistake. This was a drafting error. They never intended to cover health plans. That's absolutely false. They always did. What they did is, however, create a regulatory gap. And we all know that creating a vacuum means people move forward. So that's one myth. The second myth is a more recent myth, and that's with the recent transparency provisions that were part of the CAA. I've heard lots of speakers and read lots of articles where people say, wow, this is the first time that ERISA's fiduciary rules ever applied to health plans. Wrong. The fiduciary rules were there from the beginning, and they apply to all benefit plans.
So you mentioned former Congressman, late Congressman John Erlenborn, one of the true authors of the law. And I remember him telling me many, many years ago, after he had left Congress, actually, that despite the fact that he was intimately involved in developing the law, when the concept of the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation arose, that he almost walked away from the whole process because he was concerned with the moral hazard that employers and unions would negotiate and agree to benefits that they wouldn't be able to live up to. And so that sort of has spawned this ongoing debate in terms of whether the PBGC, you know, is or should be a social insurance program or a more traditional risk insurance corporation. And so I'd like sort of all of your thoughts on that. And, you know, did those who created the agency through the law, did they get it right with benefit of reflection? Should it perhaps have been structured differently?
Well, when I joined the PBGC, the study that was just being completed was a study related to what allowed PBGC to be included in ERISA, which was because of the issue and the debate between social and a risk-based insurance program. In order for it to pass, one of the last negotiations that Javits pushed into the system was a mandate for a contingent employer liability insurance program. And it was based on the conviction that the private insurance market would aggressively seek to make money out of essentially providing the insurance that was going to be PBGC. So PBGC itself would have to do nothing but put out regulations and work with these insurance carriers, and the private market would absorb all of the risk of the termination and funding or unfundedness based on premium payments. And the conclusion of the contingent employer liability insurance program, as I arrived, was finishing that and then became the director of the study that led to the Multi-Employer Pension Plan Amendments Act, is we had just completed the analysis of the letters that went to just over 100 insurance companies with a description of Title IV of ERISA, with a description of the objectives of the COLA program. And all of them said, we are totally uninterested. This is an uninsurable event. The agency then went to Lloyd's of London on the advice of a small firm in New York called Marsh & McLennan, the parent company of William Mercer, because they said, well, if anybody will underwrite this, Lloyd's of London will. Lloyd's of London looked at it and they came back to the agency and in a different set of words that were far more judicious, basically said, you got to be crazy. So
I
the
usually
report to
describe that
Congress,
the have you lost your mind
Correct.
conversation.
so the report to Congress was, it's unworkable. This might just as well be allowed to lapse because it cannot happen. And so what had allowed Title IV to go into the act, which was this presumption that it would in fact be a risk-based program with no social component, went out the window. And that was part of, other than the congressional mandate, what ended up influencing the structure and the approach taken under MEPA and much of the future, the PBGC, because once that was gone, to your point, the assumption became, and all of the political pressure became, this is a social obligation, with the most recent evidence of that being enactment during the Biden administration of a rather large multi-billion-dollar, should we call it a bailout, of the multi-employer pension system, and huge flow of funds from the government into those programs. And definitely now it is a social program. It has very little, if anything, to do with a risk assessment or anything any private insurance company would find doable.
Howard, your take on it?
Now, let me give you from another point of view. The actuarial profession at the time, which was really small and almost muted, had the view of, are you out of your minds? It's really not an insurable risk. It needs to be something like social insurance. But just a little more context. Prior to ERISA, actuaries were not regulated as far as pension work. We did the work following the canons of the profession, but there was no legal issue. The Academy of Actuaries was created to go to deal with government issues as opposed to just education, and went to the federal government and said, anybody can call himself or herself an actuary. That's a dangerous thing. And given the nature of the government at the time, they said, no one knows and no one cares, forget it. So then when the ERISA was developed and it included regulation of actuaries, creating the whole issue of enrolled actuaries, the answer was, well, we have to do this because you can't trust the actuaries. Well, really, we told you, we have a process, and said, well, nobody cares. And of course, they reversed it and said, why aren't we regulating you? So that's where enrolled actuaries came from. And the answer is, I'm number 113.
And a closing note, given that this is a co-sponsored event with EBRI, is within the first 10 of those policy forums were 2 policy forums related to the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, and 2 of the earliest books published by EBRI related to the issue of, can this program be made workable?
Well, I just want to echo what my colleagues said. The fact is, at the time, I mean, Dallas is right that there was a perception, at least from some quarters, that this was a true risk-based insurance. But if so, it was devised by people who didn't understand risk. It was clearly a political response. And when I came to the first thing I was handed when I came to the committee was that Seeley report that Dallas just talked about. And it was clear from talking to the people, the staff and the members who were still around, who were conferees on ERISA, that there was a very divergent point of view as to what this was supposed to be. And there were certainly members of the tax committees that saw this more as a risk-based traditional insurance program. But the people that I worked with on the Labor Committee and also on the Senate Labor Committee had a very different point of view.
I would totally agree with that, except they never would have gotten the provision in the
Well-
act in the absence of convincing Javits that this was doable. So
I
I mean,
have-
it's an interesting.
I have no doubt that that.
But
was
I
the-
totally agree with you
Yeah.
that on the Labor Committee side, the major sentiment was this should be a pure social insurance program.
Yeah.
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 So this is really interesting. Thanks to all three of you on that. Let's shift for a moment, if we may, to define contribution and the origins of the 401k. So Phyllis, I know you were up there at the time.
I was.
And
Well, I was
but you-
actually.
well, that's true.
it
You
was
weren't
long.
there
I
yet, but
just graduated.
but I think you attended the
Yes.
hearings anyway.
I had just
yeah.
graduated from law school, and the small consulting firm that I worked for, still thought I was part of their employment structure, even though I was working for free. And I got a call one day and say, could you go over to the Ways and Means Committee? They're having these hearings, which on a bill that ultimately became the tax bill of 1978. And so I was sitting there in the audience when this question about cash or deferred salary reduction plans and the 401k amendments were offered by Barbara Conable, who was, I think, the ranking Republican at the time. He was from state New York, Rochester. Kodak was, closer. Kodak and Xerox were two big constituents, and they both had problems, questions as to whether or not they could do salary reduction, employee contributions to these plans.
Yeah, arguably, and I mean, this is literally, I was emailed this morning, so I was reading it early, is because I remember we had talked on the phone about Kodak and Xerox, and it ends up Kodak created what we know today of as a 401k plan in 1960 and got it tax qualified. Xerox created the same thing, then called a deferred profit sharing plan in 1963. And they began, through Conable's entire political career, they educated him on the value of profit sharing. There was a provision in ERISA because the IRS had been seeking to declare those plans as creating taxable income on the portion that the individual employee was given the option of leaving it in the plan or taking it as cash. In other words, a 401k plan. And IRS basically get to 1974 and they get Conable to put a piece into ERISA that prohibits any additional deferred profit sharing plans from being created. By now, there are a bunch of them in banks, and there's some they spread a bit. But it's Xerox and Kodak that have the biggest ones that are being gone after by the IRS. And there's a study mandated in ERISA. And that study was sort of the equivalent of these others, and it basically ended up leading to Conable doing the Revenue Act of 78, which basically said, these are Section 401k plans, meaning we've now defined Section 401k. So in reality, the first 401k plan was created by Xerox Corporation and Kodak in 1960 and 1963. They had the equivalent of matching contributions, end quotes, but in reverse. Those plans were then amended to comply with and became basically combined 401k profit sharing plans. But all of the things that we now talk about, as others say they invented at some point in time, were actually invented by lawyers at Ivins, Phillips, and Barker law firm, which represented the Kodak company in the creation of that first plan.
Thank you for the history. I am going to ask all of you, before we wrap up, sort of what you think the ERISA's greatest accomplishment is. But before we get to that, I would like to ask each of you, what do you think was maybe the least well thought out part of the law, or maybe to put it more, more generously, could have been written more clearly?
Title IV.
I'd agree. Title IV.
Howard?
I think I'm going to give you two. PBGC and the notion of 401k, the way it was devised. Ultimately, okay, but and its impact.
Ultimately, the world we have today of 401k is actually the fault of ERISA. It is not the blessing of the retroactive 1978. You are correct. It was Barbara Conable basically saying to the IRS, you're full of it. Leave these people alone. What they're doing is legal, and we're going to make what they have been doing for 20 plus years legal through the addition of 401k to the code. And to your point, you then add that to the other things that were there, important, but never fully thought out quantitatively. None of the modeling really did it, which was the combined implications of doing broadened participation standards simultaneously with tighter vesting, simultaneously with tight vesting funding standards, and then unanticipated the joining of all of that by the Financial Accounting Standards Board to interpret those ERISA provisions as creating both retiree health ultimately and pension liabilities on corporate balance sheets, which suddenly changed this from a world that was essentially a retirement income provision through annuity payments for long service employees to something that was reallocating significant, ultimately billions of dollars to shorter service employees, thus creating the need for the retirement clearinghouse.
Yeah, there's one other factor, though, I think, Dallas, in this
Probably many.
tremendous movement away from DBs to DCs. And it's the confluence of the existence of 401ks, which I can tell you from my days sitting in the hearing room, were never intended to supplant DB plans. They were always supposed to be supplemental, but it was the confluence of that and the one provision in ERISA, if I ruled the world, that I would have struck, which is 404C, that allows and has caused the growth of individually directed accounts that leads us with the whole host of problems that we have now.
And it took 16 years to develop the regs to implement 404C.
Of course, yeah.
Howard, real quick, because I want
can't let
the
this
audience
go.
here. Yeah, go
I
ahead.
just, again, context. When this was all happening, the professions saw, the consultants saw, this is great. Now we have a possibility of having both plans work. And in some cases, we designed things called floor plan, where there was a feeder from profit sharing, but a floor of protection from DB. And then the volume of regulation and audit profession and accounting profession and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times did so much damage to all of that. You can now look at the decline of DB and unintended consequences, I would believe, but that's the result. So we're not in the place we thought we would be, and too many negative results. Too many people only can save with 401k and wind up short because, as we know, and EBRI has been telling us this for a long time, that we have inadequate retirement savings and not nearly the protection we need, especially for those who are the most needy.
Well,
I want to get into.
and you make me think of one other
Right.
piece of this that fits in,
Okay.
which is ERISA also for the first time put in the initial limitations on the design of plans engaging in Social Security integration, which was when the theory was you've got Social Security, you build on that, you build on that. And until then, the subsequent statute, which I was believe in the early 1990s, where essentially legal Social Security integration was eliminated. And so as you took away the ability to integrate, and again, to have this be supplemental for long service employees, and you got down to then 5-year vesting and proposals for 3-year cliff vesting, which were, I think, one of the earliest studies EBRI published in an issue brief form was looking at the proposals for 3-year vesting. And I'll always remember that the average benefit that that was going to create was less than $300. But when you added up the $300 over the millions of people that would have been getting $300 checks, it added up to real money. And so, I mean, you get again,
Yeah.
things done for the right policy reasons, end quotes, that end up having a series of unintended consequences, all of which that have played to the disadvantage of defined benefit plans in a 401k availability
Yeah.
environment.
If we talk fast, we might have time for one or two questions. Anybody in the audience?
Hopefully somebody's going to ask us about preemption, the crowning jewel
Okay,
of
well,
ERISA.
that was my next question, but I wanted to, all right, you set me up for it. So you also mentioned Congressman John Dent, another one of the true authors. He said that preemption was, quote, the crowning achievement of ERISA. It enabled the unions and multi-state employers to get behind the legislation and support it, and, you know, allows for what we all know. So what do you make of the efforts in recent years to essentially erode it? Do you agree with erosion? And that, I think, brings us back into the healthcare conversation
Yeah.
too.
I mean, my view of this is, while I don't agree with every single one of the pronouncements that the Supreme Court has made and the court cases necessarily, I think they by and large got it right. I think the state law, I've been getting lots of calls from Hill staff asking me what I think about these efforts to make amendments to preemption. And I think it's a very bad idea. The one thing that we know is that changing a word in 514 is going to mean 50 more years of litigation as to what it means. And the one thing that we know in our voluntary system is employers need certainty. And it's really remarkable to me, 50 years after the passage of ERISA, there's not the kind of certainty we need, particularly in the healthcare area. And I've been spending a lot of time in these later years on health. And in my view, what the states are doing is they're trying to push the envelope on preemption, but not so much in terms of plan design, plan design. What they're trying to do is get back to regulating their traditional areas of business practices. So for instance, if you look at all the legislation that the states are looking at with respect to PBMs, for instance, or other kinds of service providers in the health care area, by and large, and I put aside the any willing provider type of legislation that I think is clearly preempted, but what they're by and large trying to do is regulate business practices that, of course, do have an indirect effect on companies. And then the people who don't want regulation, the service providers, they're trying to get the business community, plan sponsors behind them by saying, well, if we have to comply with these state regulations, we're going to charge you $1 gazillion.
Well, and speak from our business members' perspective that they need that certainty and uniformity.
And
I'm gonna hold it off here, okay? And I apologies if there was anybody who did have a question, but you guys will all be around for a while and catch you during the break
Yeah.
if there were questions. So lightning round in a minute. What would you say is the law's greatest accomplishment, and what would be maybe one proposal, a policy proposal that you think would improve the employee benefit system?
The worst accomplishment is essentially over time, along with the accounting profession, the essential killing of defined benefit
After the
pension
best
plans
accomplishment.
and annuitization. And the best accomplishment was creating a system that has much wider coverage and ultimately will have much wider benefit delivery, particularly if programs can solve the lump sum distribution spending problem.
And any one proposal, well, can I take that last part of your comment as your proposal for what would be best to improve the system?
Something that basically defaults to rollovers in the absence instead of its being it's in the direction which it's traditionally been, which is the individual presumption is you do a lump sum distribution out of a defined contribution plan unless the employee doesn't want you to do it. And that's changed somewhat as the investment management firms and the administrators decided that having more money to manage over time was advantageous. But as a small employer, I know that keeping track of people over time is not an easy thing to do.
Howard.
Well, I'm smart enough to agree with Dallas 100%. But what I would say is that the other problem has always been for sponsors is Byzantine regulation, just bizarre. And remember what happened to Byzantium, and that's what.
I'll be very quick. I think the crowning achievement of ERISA was to underscore the need or to reinforce the fact that if you followed the rules and worked hard, you didn't have to be actually working on your date of retirement to get a pension. So making sure that people had pensions. As far as if I could change one thing or add one thing, I agree with Dallas on rollovers, but I think the most important thing that we should think about over the next 50 years is going back to a system where we don't have do-it-yourself retirement where professional asset managers are part and parcel of the DC plan universe, and people don't have to be their own investment manager.
So speaking of the next 50 years, I want everyone to mark their calendar for May 8th, 2074, when we will continue this conversation with our illustrious panel and get to all the questions that we couldn't get to today.
I look forward to it.
Thank you all so much. I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Mark EBRI, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Urban Brookings Institution and former Benefits Tax Counsel, 2 tours of duty in government doing that, and who's going to chat with us about the history of auto-enrollment. Mark? Oops, sorry.
I could listen to those for the whole rest of the day. Fabulous. Thank you, Jim, Barb. I've been asked to tell the backstory of what some might view as the key inflection point in the 50-year history of the private pension system since ERISA, and certainly of the 401k experience. And I'm going to do that from a personal point of view, if that's okay. So once upon a time, while I was at the Washington law firm that I was part of at the time, the Treasury Department during the Bush Senior administration reached out and asked if I'd consider coming on board to help oversee national retirement policy and the regulation of the private pension system, plus employer-sponsored healthcare, sharing those responsibilities for these issues with the Assistant Secretary of Labor. While my partners at Covington and Burling had followed this into government, back out of government route traditionally, my wife seemed to have mixed feelings about it, observing that while the Treasury job would likely involve much longer hours, even more stress, even more pressure than my law partner job, at least it offered an 80% pay cut. Well, actually, I did feel better when she told me that it must have been really hard for Treasury to find someone smart enough to handle this job, yet not smart enough to turn it down. Jim Klein, you know Daryl, my wife, from way back. And I know Jim is thinking now that doesn't sound like the nice, sweet person I know. And you're right, Jim, I made a little of that up. But the history is that I accepted the job, and the greatest challenge over the years, as you fast forward from the earlier 90s to the later 90s, was still what folks have been talking about, the ongoing decline of the defined benefit plans and the relentless shift from defined benefit to defined contribution. Our Treasury team, by 4 or 5 years after I joined the government, still didn't see a silver bullet for reviving the DBs. And yet I thought there was something a little bit off in our common narrative that the system had shifted from DBs to DCs. This seemed to be mischaracterizing the problem and maybe even getting in the way of the solution a little bit. While the 401k, of course, is technically part of a defined contribution plan, if you look past the labels, it's actually, especially back then in the 1980s, 1990s, actually more of a do-it-yourself retirement savings account than a real DC plan, like a money purchase pension plan or a target benefit plan or a profit sharing plan that are basically employer funded, that are invested under professional management, to your point, Phyllis, that you were just emphasizing, and that give people the kind of guidance that they need in a world where the average person is not and cannot be a pension expert. By contrast, the do-it-yourself 401k of that era didn't define benefits or contributions. It didn't define much of anything. The do-it-yourself suffered from what we started to call the 7 deadly sins, requiring employees to take the initiative and decide whether to participate, then to actually sign up, only after having to decide how much to contribute and how to invest. This is all too familiar to everyone in this room. Then having to decide how to monitor and update the investments over time. How do you rebalance? What is rebalancing? Adjusting the level of saving over time, if you remember to do that, whether, when, and how much to withdraw before retirement, how to convert your lump sum at retirement into a pension paycheck or a stream of income that will last for a completely unpredictable duration of years in retirement. Employees, you're on your own. So as the financial risks and challenges of retirement accumulation and decumulation have been transferred from employers to individuals, we've devolved from a defined pension system consisting of defined benefit and defined contribution plans in the past, in which employers bore the bulk of the responsibility, to an undefined saving system where benefits and contributions alike are undefined and where individuals are left to fend for themselves. So looking underneath the DB and DC labels, we wondered, and I'm still at Treasury at this point in the story, back in the mid-late 90s, we wondered whether we could identify what makes DBs particularly valuable and replicate those attributes in the 401k frame, in effect to put the pension back in the private pension system, which we've become increasingly sensitive to describing as such as we realize more and more that it isn't so much a private pension system as a private retirement savings system. The DB seemed to have its own cardinal virtues that roughly correspond to the 7 deadly sins of the of the 401k as it existed back then. And the question is whether we could transplant those virtues or good attributes to the 401k to save the soul of the do-it-yourself 401k, as it were. One day, a number of my staff came in. We were doing a briefing on the state of our agenda, all the things that were on our plate. And they said, hey, by the way, don't want to interrupt our constructive meeting, but there's this abstruse esoteric question that someone asked the IRS about whether, I think it was whether a 401k could permit someone to just could put someone right in the plan and not have them sign up and give them a chance to opt out if they wanted to, but just kind of flip the normal election, a kind of a negative election. But apparently my staff told me, no one here at Treasury or at the service has ever heard of any plan trying this. And so it sounds like just an off the wall question. And I quickly decided that if plans were not actually doing it, it wasn't important enough to take time away from our various policy projects designed to improve the system and our many other commitments. So some weeks after this remarkable failure on my part to connect the dots, the light bulb finally turned on. If negative elections were legal or could be made legal for 401ks, wouldn't they increase participation, perhaps dramatically, especially among the lower paid and underserved folks, the Black, Hispanic, and female populations that Bob Johnson was particularly focusing on this morning? And what better place to import favorable DB attributes into 401ks than to start with enrollment by arranging for people to participate unless they opt out. Before potentially approving this new technique, we'd have to describe it, define it, and name it. So our team gathered over lunch in my office one day to decide what to call this thing, assuming we decided to approve it. It's a little like a bunch of 14-year-old boys with a rock band, gathered in somebody's garage, and they kind of don't really want to practice, but they're willing to spend endless hours arguing over the name of the band. So I limit it to 45 minutes. We're not going to spend any more time than that on this. But we all were in agreement that negative election was a non-starter. This is Washington after all, right? Names matter and the spin matters. We landed on auto-enrollment, automatic enrollment, because it fairly described what was going on and would also prompt the question that we wanted the market to ask: why not extend constructive defaults to all phases of the savings cycle? Auto investment, auto rebalancing, contribution increases, rollover, Dallas, to your point, auto retirement income, hit for the cycle. And as we continued to consider whether to approve 401k auto enrollment, Congress and the executive branch were preparing to jointly hold a major Saver Summit conference on retirement savings, which Dallas Salisbury was instrumental in organizing. And President Clinton, who was then the president, Newt Gingrich, and Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott were going to address the conference. So as things are in Washington in the run-up to the conference, the White House was in full-on feed the beast mode. The president will be giving a talk. He needs some new, sexy, great initiative or proposal to announce and take credit for in his speech to the conference. I hesitated to share with the White House too early the possibility of new guidance to define and approve 401k auto enrollment. I was concerned about whether it would crowd out employer matching contributions, given that the employer match, of course, has traditionally been used to get more people in the plan and to meet non-discrimination standards. And if the market discovered that auto enrollment could be used to meet non-discrimination standards, which it can and does, will they drop the employer match? I lost a lot of sleep over that for months, trying to, with my team, figure out whether that was a real risk or not, and whether we ought to approve auto-enrollment. And so even though the pressure to feed the beast kept growing as we approached the date of the conference, which was June 4th, 1998, we kept the White House waiting as we tried to get a handle on this sort of cost-benefit analysis. We started to talk about the issue with stakeholders, and it became clear that there was great uncertainty in the market among the few people who were even talking about this, about whether it was okay to do this negative election. Most people weren't really interested in it or had never heard of the question. But then we found out that there was a company that was actually doing it, unbeknownst to us, McDonald's. But they were using auto-enrollment to default employees into McDonald's stock, which raised a policy concern for me. ESOPs are one thing. Giving employees control of the company is one thing. Small amounts of stock in a 401k to give people a little skin in the game, as long as you're fully diversified, that's another thing. But trying to push as much stock, and I'm not suggesting McDonald's was trying to do this, but the concept was evident. Lots of companies were fending off takeovers at the time. TB surpluses, until the excise tax occurred, were drawing takeovers and were used to fund takeovers, and 401ks were being stuffed, as some of us will remember, with employer stock to put a lot of stock in friendly hands and fend off the takeover of incumbent management. So I was worried about that as well as the employer match. And so we tried to figure out whether there's a way to approve auto-enrollment without triggering those two dangers. And Craig, we started a little late here, so if it's okay, I'll try to finish up. Could we use defaults not only for enrollment but investing to encourage modern portfolio theory inspired target date or balanced funds, managed accounts, diversification, and democratization of of ownership of stock? The problem was we lacked authority, legal authority, to condition the auto-enrollment permission on keeping your employer match going, on not investing in employer stock. And so instead of proposing a regulation, we decided that the preferred art form for guidance for this purpose would be a revenue ruling. A ruling tells a story, a narrative, which it then either approves or disapproves. This enabled us to include the desired behaviors in the fact pattern in the ruling that would then be approved. So in May 1998, we drafted it up. I went to the Labor Department and asked them if they would be willing to bless a diversified asset allocated investment as a default investment, since we were going to do auto-enrollment and Labor was fine with Treasury allowing that. But that meant you had to have a default investment specified. And so I suggested something like what became QDIAs. And there was a lot of sympathy at Labor, but not a willingness to actually go ahead and do that. So what we did was ask them to write a footnote to our ruling saying that they'd read the ruling, including the default investment in a diversified fund of stocks and bonds, and then say whatever they wanted to say, if it wasn't too negative. And they said, you know, it doesn't meet 404C. It isn't a self-directed, doesn't give the employer self-directed investment protection, but we've read it. And the mere fact that there was that footnote in our ruling that showed that Labor had read and cleared the ruling gave a certain impetus to the idea that even if it wasn't deemed to be a self-directed, employee self-directed investment, there was some kind of aura around modern portfolio theory asset allocated funds. We pulled the trigger in May 98, issued the revenue ruling 98-30 that defined, approved, and promoted 401k automatic enrollment and automatic investments in diversified funds. And on June 4th, President Clinton showcased the ruling in a major speech at the Savers Summit Conference and got major media coverage for the auto enrollment and the auto investing. Apparently, since the facts approved in the ruling made clear that the employer match continued, that the investment was in this diversified fund and not in employer stock, ever cautious ERISA counsel generally hesitated to let their clients venture too far from the contours of the ruling. And so it seems like those two things have stuck over the years. We haven't lost the match. We haven't had default investments pouring into employer stock. And the 401k default investments have shifted over time from principal preservation, which they used to be when there was a default, to target date funds, balanced funds, managed accounts. And this incidentally helped crowd out employer stock, which is a smaller and smaller threat, still an undue threat to employees who are over-concentrated in it. Think Enron, Lehman Brothers, and the like. As we were hoping, it also seemed to give us all of this some political cover by promoting the ownership society, 401ks writ larger, perhaps together with the fact that in the interest of not overdoing the paternalism side of this, we kept the example of default enrollment at 3% of pay, knowing that over time it would get larger, should get larger. And we then issued a bunch of other guidance a couple of years later in the year 2000 that illustrated that you could have higher defaults, that you could have automatic escalation, which Shlomo Ben-Artzi and Richard Thaler had proposed, and that you could do auto enrollment in 403Bs, 457s, et cetera, et cetera. To wrap up, a few years later, I'd left government and drafted an early version, excuse me, of the PPA, Pension Protection Act of 2006 auto enrollment provisions. There were a couple of things that we couldn't do by guidance: preempt state laws, let people get their money back within 90 days free of 72T, 10% tax if they hadn't noticed that they were auto-enrolled. And so Congressman Rahm Emanuel, who was then a member of the Ways and Means Committee, then a congressman, introduced my draft as a bill. We'd worked together in the Clinton administration on some pension things. And this became an early draft of the Pension Protection Act of 2006, auto enrollment provisions. And then a couple of us persuaded the congressional staff that this defined benefit funding bill, the 06 legislation, as well as cash balance bill, could use a little bit of just a few provisions on the side regarding automatic enrollment. And that's how we got the additional legislation. Before it was effective, 40% of large 401ks were already using auto enrollment. And since the PPA, happily, it's gone up to 75 or more percent. The George Bush administration, W. Bush, was more receptive to our suggestions about QDIAs, and Ann Combs, who many of you know, and my former law partner, Rod DeArmond, who was Deputy Secretary of Labor when Ann was Assistant Secretary. The three of us talked about finishing the job, and they were entirely willing to promote the ownership society by doing QDIA guidance. Congress found out that the regulation they drafted was about to come out, so they quickly required the Labor Department to issue a regulation of this kind, which they duly did about 3 weeks after the legislation was passed. That's the highly abbreviated version. And millions of participating employees lived happily, or at least automatically, ever after.